I'm Michael Murray. I'm head of regulatory policy at the ICO and sort of lead on the children's code and children's policy in the ICO.
So today this workshop is about regulatory cooperation between the two, particularly for age assurance with the focus of the summit. You might have seen a couple of the other presentations that the ICO or Ofcom have done. So we're going to apologise in advance if there is duplication, but part of that is because we're aware some people won't have seen all of the other ones. So if you have, just bear with us as we skip through those bits. So what we're going to be covering today is the context, so why we think it's important to collaborate and cooperate together, how we then do that, what considerations we need to take, particularly for age assurance, and then who else we collaborate with, because it's not just the ICO and Ofcom that are relevant stakeholders here. We're going to leave time at the end as well for questions, so if there is anything, let us know, including online through the chat. Happy to keep that informal and answer as many questions as possible. So in terms of some of the context for why we think this is important, online harms come in lots of many forms, as do the risks about how those harms can happen. You're more than welcome to join, come on in. So children face a range of different things online, and we are very strongly of the opinion that children not only need to be protected but empowered to realise all of their rights. So in terms of the best interests of the child, it's about empowering them to use all of their rights but in a way that means they are protected from that online harm. So there's a balance to be struck there. That's reflected in the legislation in the UK, so both data protection and online safety legislation is designed so that children can live that safer life online, and they do work together. So for example, if you are collecting lots of data about how a child's being going about online, that could actually be used to help protect them. But equally, if you collect too much of that, it could be a breach of their data protection. So it's about finding that balance and making sure the two work together. And as we've said at the end, they're not mutually exclusive. The legislation has to work together, and organisations do have to comply with both sets of rules.
Over to me. So for the ICO, our focus is on data protection and the protection of children's privacy online. So although we work very closely with Ofcom through their remit on online safety, our focus is very much on the data. So the data legislation, the regime in the UK is based on the Data Protection Act in 2018, and through the Data Protection Act 2018, the UK GDPR and the Privacy and Electronic Communications record, the PECA regulations as well. The Data Protection Act in 2018 required the ICO to develop a code of practice, recognizing Recital 38's requirements of that children merit special protection for their data. That requirement was the Age Appropriate Design Code, which we developed over the following 2 years. And in 2020, the code came into law with a 1-year transition phase for organizations to update their processing to conform with the code. The Children's Code is a age-appropriate design guide for online services to help them understand how to apply the standards or the articles of the UK GDPR to their processing of information. So when we're looking at supervising the Children's Code, for example, what we're looking at is how organizations conform with the code, but how they comply with the underlying law, underlying GDPR. So, for example, if a company if we have an issue, the Irish DPC earlier was talking about the importance of transparency. So transparency is one of the code standards. But if we were to find a company that's not conforming with the transparency standards, we would also look at the underlying Article 5 transparency requirements of the GDPR to take any sort of regulatory action we might want to take. So the two are intricately linked, the code to the UK GDPR. The code and the regime are based on this risk-based approach to people's data, and fundamentally back to the principles of Article 5. So everything from fairness and transparency, data minimization, security, accuracy, and then even into the Article 5.2 requirements on accountability. So whereby the data controller needs to consider how they are applying standards of the code and the UK GDPR to their processing, and take a risk-based approach to age assurance in that processing. The code's article standard 3 of the code is about age-appropriate application. And within that element, there are two sides. So the code basically says that services can apply the standards of the code to all users and therefore not require age assurance, because basically they would be protecting the data of all users, including children, or take a risk-based proportionate way of applying age assurance to identify the age of users and protect them, the age of children and protect them online. So there's a choice built in for services about how they conform. The code itself is designed to be putting the choice back on children to say what they want. So children have the choice to say, for example, that they want their geolocation off, or they want to turn it back on. They don't want profiling. That should be the default setting, but they can turn profiling on if they choose to. The choices are the child's or the parents', not the company's. So after we created the code, and the code is quite extensive, 15 standards of the code, we were asked further information about more detail about how companies could conform with standard 3 of the code on age appropriate design, especially on the age assurance elements. That resulted in an opinion on age assurance being published in 2021, which set out our views at the time. Since 2021, we have run sessions with industry, with other stakeholders, civil society groups, children's organizations, providers of age assurance, to learn more about how the system works. We have updated our guidance on when services are likely to be accessed by children. The Online Safety Act has come into place, and we wanted to give more certainty to organizations about the legislative requirements around age assurance. So all these led to us to agreeing that we would update the children's, the opinion on age assurance. We completed that update early this year, and it was published in January. The update is basically around 4 key elements, and those are the ones I just mentioned. So working with Ofcom to align our requirements with the requirements of the VSP regime and the Online Safety Act. More clarity on using what we call a must, should, could approach. Must being the legislation says you have to do something. This is the must. And there's other should and the coulds would be good practice to do as well. This should give organizations better regulatory certainty about the requirements that they have under the law for age assurance and how they can meet those requirements. We've also updated the opinion to make it clear about when a service is likely to be accessed by a significant number of children, following the publication of our guidance of that in 2023. So those are the major changes. Significant rewrite of the whole document, which is basically where our views on age assurance for the Children's Code at the moment. We are aware that the ISO standards are under development. We are also preparing for a change in the core data protection law in the UK. Data Protection and Digital Information Act is currently going through Parliament, and there will likely be changes to both the Children's Code and wider requirements for organizations on things like high-risk processing. So with that in mind, we will likely have to change the code in the future, and then we will go back and revisit the Commissioner's opinion again, probably in another couple of years, and update that opinion, potentially turning it into a guidance document that learns from the ISO standard, learns from further engagement with industry on what's technically possible, what's the state of the art, and continues to develop our understanding of what's required to conform with the law. Just last week, we also published a strategy for children in 2024-25 period. One of the items from that strategy is to look at the processing of data for under 13s by social media and video sharing platforms. So that's the major age assurance element of this, but throughout the strategy is a strategy for children's data and children's processing. So of course, we need to know who a child is, so that's fundamental to age assurance as well. But the hypothesis that we're looking at is that social media and video streaming are often processing data for under 13s without parental consent. So we're going to be looking at what information we can gather from social media sites and video streaming sites about who conforms with Article 8 and Article 25 of the GDPR, find evidence of non-conformance, and then take action thereafter, whether that be engagement or supervision action. That kind of brings us up to date at the moment about what the ICO is doing. So I'll hand back over to Julia, who will continue for Ofcom.
Fab. Hopefully that's updated. So from Ofcom, there are two main areas that we have legislative remit that relates to age assurance. The first is the video sharing platform regime. So that was a piece of EU legislation, the EU's Audiovisual Media Services Directive. The UK transposed that a number of years ago, so that's found within our Communications Act. And within that, there are a number of requirements for the relevant video sharing platforms to protect under 18s from material that can impair their physical or moral development. There are also a number of other requirements in there. So, for example, to protect all users from illegal content and from content that's likely to incite terror or violence. But for the purposes of this summit, the age assurance provision is that one about protecting physical, mental and moral development. That has applied to about 22 different video sharing platforms for a number of years, and we've been regulating that, and we brought out guidance back in 2020, 2021 for that. It's a lot narrower than the Online Safety Act, that's clear to say, but actually going through that process has led us to learn a lot about how we can bring out guidance that is helpful, which is technology neutral, and which is principles based, that enables organisations to make changes to protect users, but in a way that still meets their needs as well. So it isn't prescriptive, it doesn't say you must bring out or use one particular thing. It just says that you have to have that sort of measure in place to prevent children from accessing that information. So that's what we've had since 2020. In addition to that, we have the Online Safety Act. So it passed through our Parliament in October 2023. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it because I know there have been a number of other sessions. Some of you have probably heard quite a lot about it. But to give you the relevant bits for age assurance, those are set out in two different areas of the Online Safety Act. So one we often refer to as Part 3. That's where there are provisions for age assurance for all users and making age appropriate environments. So for example, not just looking at where somebody is over 18, but where someone is, for example, 8 or 13, if you're putting in place different measures to protect children and need to know their different ages. But those apply to all of the services that are search services, user-to-user services under the Online Safety Act. Whereas again, there's a narrower area, and that is Part 5 guidance. So that's for service providers that have been publishing pornographic content. So as I say, it's a lot narrower. It's generally those services that have editorial responsibility rather than those that have self-generated content and user-to-user content. They're very specific definitions, so we can show more information about those, but that's a very high level of it. For that Part 5, for those service providers publishing pornographic material, we've already published our draft guidance on that, and it has just finished a consultation period, so we're in the process of reviewing all the responses to that consultation with a view to then updating the guidance to publish it. And then for that first bit, Part 3, for the user-to-user and search services, we're due to publish guidance on that again in draft version for consultation later on this spring. So we expect that to likely be in May time. When we bring that out, it will come out with a lot of different things like explainers, and we're likely to do webinars and things. So if you're interested, you're welcome to sign up on our website to get information about those when it comes out. We're happy to answer any questions when it's published about more of the information in that. But you'll also see in a slightly interesting formatting issue that we've given a bit of information about what it will mean for services in general. So again, this is at quite a high level, but in general, we expect that where there's content that could be harmful to children, services first will have to carry out an assessment of whether they're likely to be accessed by children. If they are, they have to carry out a risk assessment to assess what risks there could be to children based on their service, their functionalities. They then have to act on that, so they have to mitigate those risks in whatever way they think is best. And we will be bringing out that guidance that gives more information about how we as the regulator understand a lot of the risks and how we think they can be mitigated. So we will be bringing that out to help services, but it isn't required that they take the measures that are in that guidance. It's there to help, but if they want to do something else, they're more than welcome to. If they think that it works better, that is entirely up to them to make sure that there's still space for innovation and trying new things and developing new ways to protect children. At that point, we expect that will prevent children from encountering harmful content if they should be prevented entirely, or protecting them if we think that it's something that some children might be able to access but not others. We expect there to be clear and consistent terms and conditions, and crucially that those are applied, so they're not just on a one page that set them out, but they aren't applied and people don't know about them, they're not in force. And we will be bringing out those codes of practice to give that guidance. But as I say, it doesn't have to be followed, it's there to help. But services still have that innovative way to do it. So all that's to say, we have three big different areas where we have this guidance. The video sharing platform regime has given us a really good basis and understanding that we're then using to shape a lot of the work we're doing under the Online Safety Act. We've already published one of the pieces for consultation and closed that, and we're working on updating that. We hope to have the other one out this spring. So we are working at pace to get all of this done pretty quickly. That's within other areas like illegal harms, where we've already published a consultation as well. So it's one and two of the many different pieces, and happy to zoom in with a little bit more detail on any of those if people have questions at the end. But that's a very quick moment in time snapshot. And it's probably worth saying this is year one for us of bringing in the drafts and the consultations and guidance for the Online Safety Act. Everything there is new, so we do expect over time, once those are in place, that they will be updated on and developed, similar to what Michael has said the ICO have done with the Children's Code and with the Age Assurance Opinion. We will be updating these. It's not a case that as soon as they're out there, that's sort of them done for good. It will be a continual iterative process, and it's one that we work together on quite a lot.
So Julia mentioned the likely to be accessed by children guidance from Ofcom. So both organizations use the same language, likely to be accessed by children, but we're coming at it from a slightly different perspective. So here's one of those examples of how we have cooperated. Well, when the ICO was publishing its likely to be accessed by children guidance in 2023, we engaged closely with Ofcom on what was anticipated to be coming through with the Online Safety Act. So that although they're not completely aligned, because there's a children's access assessment requirement, first of all, with OSA, that isn't repeated in the GDPR, the two requirements, I think, are fairly closely aligned, so that we're not expecting a lot of additional steps from organizations to meet the GDPR or the ICO's requirement for likely and Ofcom's requirement. Julie also talked quite a lot about risk assessments, and that's one of the areas we're going to be talking a lot about with Ofcom colleagues in the year to come, not only because of the GDPR's requirements for data protection impact assessments, that's also in the Children's Code, but I mentioned the DPDI legislation going through Parliament now. We'll potentially see the DPIA requirement replaced with the risk assessment. So we'll both be, again, using similar language, but from different perspectives, and might have slightly different requirements for those documents. So it's one of those areas we're looking at for future collaboration, but we'll watch this space, I think, all space we can say.
So in terms of why we're doing this and what we hope to achieve, we want to align that approach at the end of the day so that it's a safe life online, particularly for children, and that they're supported and empowered as much as possible. But we do also want to minimise the cost of compliance for organisations and online safety services. because the more that they're then able to do this in a way that means children's user experience is enhanced, it's part of the sort of journey flow and the user journey that they're going through. It sort of means it's a better outcome for those users, particularly for us, those children. So the two aims we have are on the screen. So one is for the users to have confidence that both safety and privacy are upheld and that it isn't a case of one or the other, and that we take prompt and effective action where we think providers fall short of those obligations, and that is joint action as well. We're looking very closely at how we can do that. The other side then, as well as the users, as I've said, is those online services. So we want services of all sizes to comply. And I think that's actually a really important point, because we know that a lot of services really want to do the right thing and they want to protect children. They want to make sure they have a safe experience and that their personal data is protected. But there can at times be requirements that it's hard for them to understand when they're trying to, deal with so many other areas as well as online safety and data protection, that it's as clear and simple for them to do that as possible. And rather than spending their time understanding the requirements, it's really easy to understand them and they spend their time implementing them and giving that positive experience for users. It also gives the chance, as I mentioned already, for them to innovate and grow, so to develop new and interesting ways of protecting users. We heard, for example, in the talk earlier by the CNAIL about different areas where actually there's space for new solutions with age assurance to be developed. We're really interested to see what any of those new solutions can be, and we're aware that the solutions that we have today can work tomorrow, but there could be new solutions tomorrow that we haven't thought of yet. So it's really about leaving that space for the services that know their users, that know the risks of their services. They're able to put in place something that is really tailor-made to be effective on that service. So for a few examples of how we've worked together, Michael's already spoken a little bit about how we work together on guidance, but actually another really key area as well is our research and our evidence base. So we're both evidence-based regulators that need to have that evidence-based underpinning for any of the work we do, whether that's the policy, the guidance that we bring out to support organisations, or in any of the supervision and enforcement action that we might take. Everything has to be evidence-based, so pretty critical we have some evidence there. For that, we've actually undertaken some research together. Two of the different pieces are on the screen that are relevant to age assurance. I should say we do also work on other areas together, but obviously the topic today we're here to talk about is age assurance. But we work together, as Michael said, there's a broader children's strategy, and we work on a number of different areas as well. But for example, we've undertaken research on families' attitudes towards age assurance. Families there, we're talking about parents, those with parental responsibility like grandparents, foster carers, as well as children. So we looked at their attitudes, and it was a really interesting piece of research where we found that people had a competing desire for control and flexibility over what children did online. Often parents felt that they saw a very different online experience to what their children would see on the same platform because it was tailor-made to them. So often there were differing expectations around the level of risk, and then where children needed additional protections put in place through age assurance. There were concerns about sharing data online, but there were also big concerns about the effort required. So a lot of the times parents were saying that they don't necessarily understand how one particular service differs from another, and often how different age assurance solutions can differ from one another. And when you have 30 minutes to get dinner on the table and you have a child asking you to please give access, it's not always possible to spend lots of time together on a teachable moment to work through it together. Often parents are very overworked and stressed, that they really want information in easy to access tangible chunks so that they feel empowered in making those decisions with children. We've also done a lot of work together around, I think that slide's slightly needing updated. I think the second bit is around some of the guidance where we've worked closely together. And for a lot of that, it's because the guidance that we're bringing out at Ofcom is around written records. So for the Part 5 service providers publishing pornographic content and the consultation that we've already undertaken, there were requirements for written records, and we're very aware that under the accountability requirements, in particular under GDPR, there are requirements for showing that written record and showing that accountability. So we wanted to make sure that we were as aligned as possible, and we have worked very closely on that guidance. So for example, the ICO is a statutory consultee. We make sure that they see all of our guidance as early as possible to be able to feed in concerns and considerations at a really early stage. And actually, it's really helped a lot of our policy development to have it at that early stage, as well as then when it's formally published for everybody to see. Is there anything you want to speak about on that?
Say about statutory consultancy, so you.
Okay, perfect. So in terms of the shared approach that we have, I think it really helps that we have a lot of underlying principles that are actually very similar in terms of how we have a regulatory approach. So we heard quite a lot from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner earlier about transparency, which is really crucial. So if you don't have that transparency, you don't know how you're being protected, you don't know how your personal data is being processed. You need that accountability as a service. Everything has to be proportionate. So again, with the CNAIL earlier, they talked about that proportionality, having a risk-based approach. But there's also an element of consistency as well. So we want to make sure that in any of the guidance we're bringing out, it is consistent, easy to understand and clear. We did publish a joint statement about our approach to working together, which is linked if the slides are shared afterwards, and provides more information, but you can find it online as well if you're interested in more information. But I think an underlying point that was mentioned earlier today as well is about making sure it's future-proof and technology neutral. So it's not about saying this one particular thing in this particular circumstance works. It's about those principles that can be flexibly applied in a way that allows that innovation and also allows for interoperability and accessibility. Those are two key areas that we included in Ofcom's Part 5 guidance and that are also mentioned in things like the Commissioner's opinion on age assurance, but making sure that it's easy to use for all users, particularly those that might have accessibility requirements, but also that it's interoperable across different online services, across different platforms. And then at some stage, we will talk about across different jurisdictions as well, but that's a whole other area which is of interest. So it is really key that all of that works together with those underlying principles, and having that shared understanding and shared approach really makes it a lot easier to hit the ground running with working together on these different areas.
I think we've probably covered most of this one, Julia. So the November 2022 was the joint statement, which included a section on age assurance in the statement. And that was really the launch of regular meetings between the ICO age assurance team and the Ofcom age assurance team. So for full transparency, we probably meet about twice a month, though we did for at least about a year and a half. Ahead of the Part 5 guidance being published and ahead of the Commissioner's opinion on age assurance being published. And in those meetings, we would share those documents back and forth with each other to ensure that that what Ofcom was publishing for its consultation and what ICO was publishing for the Commissioner's opinion were aligned, complementary, and consistent. So we unfortunately missed the deadline for the Part 5 publication by about half a month or so, but the intention always was that for the Part 5 to link over to the updated Commissioner's opinion, and that for both documents to basically have the seal of approval of both organizations as they go forward. So that sort of commitment to joint working has been in place since before November 22 and continues going forward. Operationally, Julia's mentioned the families research. We also did some research with ACCS on measures of age assurance accuracy, both as ICO alone, but also with Ofcom. And both organizations do separate research where we involve the other in the process. We will share questions, we will share results, so that it's good for the taxpayer in a sense, because it means we get more bang for our buck. We learn more through each other's work than we can ever accomplish alone. And that sort of commitment to sharing is embedded in the teams that work closely together. It helps that ICO's office now in London is in the same building as Ofcom, so, and we've got better coffee apparently, so we often have host meetings. Since that publication of the opinion, we continue to engage. So Julie's mentioned Part 3. As a statutory consultee, we will review those documents with Ofcom and give our feedback. But of course, it is Ofcom's document. It's Ofcom's policy, it's Ofcom's decision making, but we will consult on those, and we'll continue to do so. And we will continue to consult with Ofcom in the updating of the Commissioner's opinion. If when the Children's Code needs to be updated post DPDI, we will consult with Ofcom on those examples as well. It's baked in now between the two organizations on how we work together. And there's a commitment going forward on that.
So we've talked quite a lot about how we work together domestically with a lot of our guidance, but I think it's pretty important to say a lot of online services are operating internationally across multiple borders, multiple jurisdictions. So we are very aware that as regulatory cooperation develops, at Ofcom we're working very closely with a number of video sharing platform regulators in the EU for the video sharing platform regime that I mentioned at the very start, but we're also working with a number of other regulators globally for online safety. So particularly in the EU, those are digital services coordinators, but more broadly, a lot of that is through the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, which we'll talk about a little later on. Similarly, the ICO work very closely with other data protection authorities. So we are very aware of the importance of having regulatory cooperation internationally as well as domestically. So we've talked quite a lot about some of our guidance. So these are, this is basically what a lot of that guidance says in a very high level one slide. So, you know, there's lots more detail, there's lots more nuance, but what we've brought out for the service providers that publish pornographic content, we've essentially given a list of options that we think at Ofcom could be highly effective, and we had ICO input to that. So you can see that in the blue box. So we've said that those different elements could be highly effective age assurance to protect children from harmful material. At the same time, we've said what's not helpful. So self-declaration has come up a few times today to bring it in, to rule it out in many instances. But there were a couple of other areas that we felt were not highly effective that aren't always talked about quite as much. So one of those was payment methods that don't require a user to be over 18. We didn't feel that was highly effective at making sure users were over 18 for obvious reasons. And then general contractual restrictions. So often you'll see things in terms and conditions in those contracts. We don't think that if a child has to sign up to those, that can be deemed an effective piece of age assurance. So those are some of the areas where we've really tried to bring out clarity. Again, it's not prescriptive. Organisations could take a different approach, but that's indicative of what we think could be effective. And you'll also see in the purple box, we've said a little bit about the Commissioner's opinion as well. Do you want to speak to that?
So it's an example of where the two regimes collaborate and are complementary. So we were aware that Ofcom was view that self-declaration was not going to be a highly effective means. We also had that in the Commissioner's opinion that for high-risk processing, self-declaration is not a satisfactory form of age assurance. So this picks up as well, not just on our relationship, but also in our relationship with CNIL. Antoine mentioned it earlier on in his presentation. So it's trying to get the sort of minimum standards approach that all regulators can agree on. But the requirements for Part 5 are mirrored in the opinion and in the Children's Code, where we basically say that organizations that are not intended for use by children, they should be focusing on keeping children out of those services rather than making those services age appropriate. So a pornography service, for example, would fall under Part 5, but we would also say that that service should be applying the age assurance techniques rather than trying to apply the standards of the code. So the two are complementary. So the service can meet the requirements of Ofcom's, OSA, and also the data protection at the same time.
So a lot of that is talked about the guidance, the policy, the research, the evidence base. There's probably a very fair, valid question then about what's next, particularly when it comes to supervising and enforcing those requirements. That's always a key area. And to be honest, from our perspective at Ofcom, the reason why we haven't focused on that as much today is because we are at the stage with the Online Safety Act of implementing the requirements and putting in place that policy. That's where our focus is. Once we have that in place, that's when we're able to take enforcement action. So we've started our supervision of online services, and we're working very closely with the ICO to develop our approach to joint supervision where there are high-risk services. We know that that will be beneficial to the regulators to make sure that we're taking proportionate approaches and making sure that we're taking action to protect children on the services that pose the highest risk to them. But it's also helpful for the services, even from the perspective of the time taken to have meetings with regulators. That immediately moves it from 2 meetings to 1 because they're able to have it jointly. We're able to engage in a way that optimises everyone's resources, again, to have that effective outcome for children, that they are effectively protected. I know that there's a little work on input to standards, but I'm going to pass to Michael in a minute to talk about that. At the minute, what I was going to just flag is that we do continue to cooperate and consult on that guidance. So Michael's already mentioned some of the constructive help that Ofcom received from the ICO in developing our guidance. As we then look at the consultation responses and we engage and update the guidance based on that, we'll continue to have that back and forth where we get guidance, we seek feedback, and we update it based on it. And we also do collaborate a lot with international regulators. So I mentioned very briefly earlier the Global Online Safety Regulators Network. That was only set up, we're in the second year. The Australian eSafety Commissioner was the inaugural chair last year, and Ofcom's very honoured to be the chair this year, with the vice chair here at the summit as well from the South African Film and Classification Board. So we are really delighted to be working with other regulators. There's a range of different online safety regulators involved from South Korea, from ARCOM in France, from the Irish Commission Man. We have a number of others as well, but I think it's really important to flag because it's an area where before we didn't have as many counterparts that were working on online safety. Australia were the first, they were working there for a very long time, and it's really important to have a forum similar to what the ICO have with other data protection authorities globally, that we have something similar with other online safety regulators. We know that these things are being worked on globally. For example, eSafety's Kelly Talon was speaking earlier this morning about age assurance as well. So it's really important to learn from one another, particularly when a lot of the age assurance solutions can be brought out in many different countries. They then need to work for all of the users in those different countries. So we are very aware and cognizant of that in a lot of our work. We have working groups for the first time this year in the Global Online Safety Regulators Network. One is around education and awareness, and one is around technology. Age assurance is a key theme in both of those, which I'm sure is no surprise. So sharing, learning from one another, but also very crucially getting input from observers. So there is observer status available to organisations that are not regulators but have an interest in the area. There's more information on the website if it's something that you think is of interest, and happy to speak to people afterwards. But it's also really important for us. For example, there are civil society organisations, those that represent young people and children. It's really important to get that input to the different work that we're doing to make sure that it does work for everybody. So that's probably all I have to say on it, but I'm aware there's a couple of bits there.
Yep, on the international level, so the ICO is a member of the BSI working group for the age assurance ISO standard. So we fed into that along with other data protection agencies, the CNIL notably, and we'll continue to do that until that first draft is completed. Separately, we are keen to find international solutions and collaborations, knowing that most of the services that we supervise are international or global in some ways. In the first 2 years of the Children's Code supervision, most of the companies that we identified as the highest risk of non-conformance were not based in the UK. So that shows the importance of collaboration internationally on the policy element for what is effective age assurance, but also on the engagement and enforcement element. So just this week, the ICO's Commissioner John Edwards was in the US and signed an agreement with some Asia Pacific countries, including Canada, Australia, the US, Japan, Korea, and a few others, to enable sharing of information for enforcement. That's really important to us. For example, so when we were doing that first round of supervision, there's a few Silicon Valley companies that we identified had problems conforming with the Children's Code and complying with UK GDPR. Having the FTC to back us up or to share information with us on issues that we ourselves find difficult, finding a contact information, for example, or sharing evidence of non-conformance with each other's laws is critically important to successful regulation in this space. On a level down, we started the International Age Assurance Working Group in 2022. And it started probably with only about 4 or 5 countries just to share policy, research, information on what each of the data protection authorities that were members of the group was doing. From quite a small start, we're now up to 29 members and growing. That covers members from 6 continents. So it's truly international. And it's been a great example of regulators learning and sharing. In many ways, the CNIL, the ICO, the AAPD, the FTC, and some are more advanced in the policy development on age assurance than some of the smaller members or the newer members. So we share what we've learned, but we're also keen to learn about initiatives in Asia and Africa and South America and elsewhere, and to learn from experience of enforcement in those jurisdictions as well. So we're really committed to keeping this going and to growing that network, and then linking the International Age Assurance Working Group over to GPA working groups as well, as we develop how these bodies collaborate. It's available to NGOs as well. We've got 3 NGOs that are members, and it's available to online safety organizations. So eSafety is a member, and Ofcom could be if they choose to join. Julie has given a presentation at one of these meetings recently. We're going to have her back again as well soon. She did such a great job. So that sort of outlines how critically important it is for us that we collaborate internationally and we learn from the good practice in age assurance space. We're watching the developments of the double-blind system in the CNIL and the system in the APD is developing, because the ICO is not doing that sort of technology work ourselves. So we're really interested to see how our stakeholders and our partners internationally are developing in this space. So that's, I think, both up to date so far.
So we're happy to take any questions. We've left about 10-15 minutes to do so. Otherwise, we do actually have a couple of questions for you guys afterwards. But Julie, I can see your hand. I'm assuming you've to use this mic as well for people online. So bear with us.
Thank you very much. And it was brilliant to see the close working relationship between the 2 organisations and the 2 of you, and we see that reflected frequently. One thing I did wonder was whether one of the topics where we could expect more guidance upcoming in the UK, perhaps in the EU with other international regulators, is in the sort of the transparency. You had those 4 points: transparency, accessibility, proportionality, consistency, but at a more detailed level, specifically with AI algorithms, but also with other approaches. And I just wondered, will we be looking at guidance that might say, how should organizations portray the origins of data, how it's been collected, what the level of liveness is it independently reviewed that an image is deleted, what is the status of say, joint controller processor? Would we get to that level of detail, do you think, upcoming? Is that the sort of things that are being discussed in the working group? Because I think looking at, we've achieved a lot in this last period and we've got the international standards, but I think the devil's always in the detail. And at the moment, there are some of those areas whereby there's probably quite a range, there's quite a spectrum. And actually saying what good is, what the minimum is, could potentially be quite helpful. So perhaps a suggestion as well as a question.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Julie. I'll start this one. So transparency has been critical for us from the start. It's one of the standards in the Children's Code. And because of the fundamental importance of transparency, we actually worked with stakeholders to develop some good practice guidance. So looked at what some progressive organizations were doing in the space and published that guide. That's still available on the ICO website. So as a starter, I'd get organizations to look there for what we think is good looks like. I'm looking at the updated Commissioner's opinion. In section 6.1.3 is all about transparency and the requirements here. So I mentioned that sort of must, should, could approach. And I think this is probably as close as we're going to get to what you're looking for at this stage, Julie, is that guidance talks about organizations must be clear, open, honest about how you use people's information for age assurance purposes. So once we say that there's a must, there is an element of the UK GDPR backing it up. So again, that's why the DPC was able to levy such significant fines, is because transparency is so critical to the Article 5 principles. So it's in here in the Commissioner's opinion about what you must do, and that continues on. You must explain clearly why you are using age assurance, what personal information you need for age assurance, whether you use a third party, how you use personal information. These are all the musts. So it's unlikely we'll go much further than that, because with the ICO, there's 100 and so thousand organizations who could fall within scope of the code. And it goes such a broad range of organizations, from international social media companies to one-man bands, one-woman bands who are creating their first game. So trying to be too prescriptive on what's required is challenging, but we will continue to look for good practice case studies. For example, I think it would be useful perhaps if we revisit that initial document perhaps in the future, if we've got capacity to do so. But anybody who sees some good examples, please do share it with us.
Yeah, I would echo everything Michael has said. And I think it's probably getting to the heart of the challenge between being specific enough to be helpful and not so prescriptive that it prevents organizations. And I think that balance is one we always aim to strike, but it's very difficult to do it in every single instance, especially at the minute when I would say we're year one for the Online Safety Act of bringing out the guidance. So we do need that evidence base to put things in, for example, our codes of practice. And we have to make sure that anything that we're putting in that is already demonstrated to be effective, and what effective means is another conversation we can happily have about all the different elements that come into play there. So you can expect more guidance from us in terms of the part 3, so the user to user and search services. That's due out in May. So hopefully that will show a little bit more about what we expect for the other services that aren't the narrow service providers publishing pornographic content. But I think actually some of the elements you mentioned aren't just unique to age assurance. So some of the elements for AI, that also applies to a lot of the other elements of the Online Safety Act and data protection when it comes to how AI is used for content moderation as well, for recommender systems, for a lot of other areas. So I think at the minute, it's unlikely we would go into specific detail of it for one particular piece of technology. Again, partly trying to be technology neutral, being aware that the pace of development at times can probably outstrip the pace of being able to bring out guidance that's to that level of granularity. But having said that, we have a team at Ofcom working on promoting compliance, and a lot of what their job will be is to explain a lot of the requirements to organisations of all shapes and sizes, of all different industries. So we've some that might just have one particular part of the Online Safety Act that applies, but others might have a lot of other areas. So as it develops, that team in particular will have a pretty busy job, and we might see that they bring out specific guidance in those types of areas, but we haven't committed to doing anything like that at the moment, mainly because we're aware of the volume of guidance we have to get out at the initial stage. Once that's out and we continue to develop that evidence base and we're able to update it, it might go further, particularly as we're aware that there are needs that aren't being met or there's areas that aren't clear. But I think at the minute it's probably too early for us to go into that level of granularity, particularly with the pace of the technological development. What I would say is we're continuing to do that consultation. So in May, one of them comes out. we'd welcome that feedback. So if it's something that you think going through it needs more granularity or it needs more depth in particular areas, by all means, please do let us know. We want to know, because the more we hear from different people, the more we can try and tailor it to the needs. I'm so glad you close.
Thank you. Mark Hain, OpenID Foundation. You mentioned interoperability a little earlier. I'd love to know more about what you're thinking about that, who you're thinking of collaborating with, and is there going to be consultation around that topic as well?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely something we're thinking about. We've already consulted a little bit in that Part 5 guidance that came out that I mentioned, that I'm sure you're all sick of hearing me say at this point. But yeah, it had a little bit about interoperability. It's something that we're continuing to look at. It'll also be in what comes out in May. But in particular, we're looking at it around the services. So is there a way that if you are able to use an age assurance for one particular service, that can be used for other services? There are challenges around different levels of risk. So actually, is it then appropriate for a different service with different functionalities? There's also interoperability across borders. So, if you go to a different country, in the UK, we have 4 different countries, let alone then if you go to different jurisdictions. So there are lots of different challenges there that we're thinking of. It's probably fair to say we're willing to engage and work with as many different people as possible. We're aware that different solutions might be more feasible to be interoperable than others at different times. So we're looking at it closely. We haven't really come to any set granular response because it's through the consultations. We're looking for more information. But from our perspective, for user journeys in particular, interoperability will be one of the key areas, but it's making sure that it's done in a way that, particularly how that data is being processed, how that goes from one controller to another, how that links back to the transparency. Those are big areas that we are really keen to continue working on, because we don't yet have the answers. We're not aware of anybody that does. If you do, please come and talk to us. But it's something that we're working closely with all our international partners to understand what they're doing as well. We want to, find out what works best, but probably fair to say no set answers at the moment.
Yeah, agreed. I think we're just keeping an eye on what's happening on EU consent, and just keeping update on that in definitely gives us updates on a regular basis. But then we'll probably have to do some more as the data protection issues that arise out of EU consent become better known. At this stage, I think it's waiting and see how things develop, but we're quite keen to still be involved or understand how it's developing, but nothing more than that at this stage.
Ed and Ty from SIPL. Michael, you mentioned that the ICO isn't working on technology, developing technology like CNIL or APD. I was just wondering, do you think this could change in the future? And is there any particular reason why you guys aren't looking into it at the moment?
Thank you. We take a technology neutral approach to it. And even Antoine this morning was talking about the CNIL doing something similar, taking a technology neutral approach to age assurance. So it's not unique to the ICO's approach. We have made that decision that for us, the market is delivering technology, and we don't want to sort of develop a technology that might only be appropriate for one part of our user base. We don't have the resources to do it, and there's a lot of excellent organizations working in this space already. However, we do have a regulatory sandbox where age providers who are interested in answering a specific data protection concern or issue can come in. And I'm looking at Julie Castiotti was the first age assurance provider in that sandbox. So that's how we feel that we're better able to support the sector rather than trying to develop solutions separately, independently.
Yeah, one question from Jen Pearson online. Jen Person, sorry. it's on transparency. Does training algorithms and product development require consent as a lawful basis? And can it be bundled with decision to use the system, RE, freely given nature of consent?
Thanks, Jen. I can always rely on you for a good question. I'm going to defer that one to you. I'll talk to you separately on that one. But the recommender systems are part of the children's strategy in 2024-25. So we will be looking at how social media and VSP providers use algorithms to deliver content, harmful content to children. And that's something, again, we'll be working closely with our colleagues at Ofcom on. So I think at this point it's probably best if I say I'll get back to Jen on that one as we learned a bit more the answers to that effectively.
So I'm very conscious we've been told to finish up, to give you a few minutes to, get a cup of tea, coffee. Our contact details are there. You're very welcome